related to the projects we've funded, or some of the additional work that's going on within our geography or nearby that is of importance to the partnership. In a few minutes here, we'll turn this over to Lisa and Mike to talk about the work that they've been front and center with at Northern Prairie here the last couple of years. But Ashley, I see that you've joined us. Are we recording now?
We sure are, Mike.
Thanks. I'm going to actually ask you, Ashley, to provide a quick update relative to some of the things that we've been doing relative to the website update, and maybe mention to the technical team folks and maybe the project leaders online about receiving electronic copy of the report coming out here within a week.
Sure, not a problem. Hi, folks. This is Ashley Spratt. I'm the communications coordinator for LCCs here in the Midwest region. And we're very excited. We're actually doing a major overhaul of our Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC website. We've realized there's really been a very big need for the development of an online workspace where folks like the technical committee and other working groups can share their documents and share information. So one of the functions of our newly designed website will be the development of that online workspace. It will also provide a directory for members that can see who's involved in which parts of the LCC partnership, as there are many different layers and many different groups involved. So we are very excited about that. We did also just complete our final review and printing of our annual reports, and we will be mailing out hard copies to our steering committee members, but we do also have the online digital version available to everybody, so you can take a look at that and download. It is currently located on our current Plains and Prairie Potholes lcc.org website, so you can take a peek at that and see what types of projects have been funded since the LCC began several years ago. Also look at some of the priorities of the LCC and some of the communications strategies that we have been employing as well. I'd be happy to answer any questions about that. Mike?
Anybody have any questions for Ashley? I guess I'd just like to thank all those folks who have assisted with the development of the annual report over the last few months and provided very good constructive comments. I think it's our first effort at summarizing the work that's been going on, and it's very well done, and thank you, Ashley, for all your work at pulling that together. One thing on our new website, if it's not on there already, will be probably a link to something that came out nationally here in the last week or so. At the North American Conference, there was the rollout of the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy, and that's something that many of our partners have been tracking. I see Jeff Vonk was personally responsible for some of the rollout of that. He's with the South Dakota Game Fish and Parks, and that adaptation strategy is certainly something that the LCCs as a whole will be following as we develop some sort of comprehensive strategy for addressing climate change and the fish, wildlife, and plants, which are so near and dear to all of us on this call. I think with that, I'm going to ask Rick if there's any other updates from the LCC that you want to pass along. I know here in the last few minutes you've been getting some updated numbers relative to the budget, but I don't know if you've got any new information on that or not.
Well, we, as you all know, the continuing resolution was passed, but we were waiting to find out what percent reduction we would have to take, and we just got those numbers this morning. And so over the course of the next day, Mike and I are going to be working up a spreadsheet to get to our steering committee to give them the new numbers so that we can move forward with funding the ongoing projects that we have and potentially being able to fund one of the new ones that we got in with FY13. Like everybody in the federal government, we took quite a hit with the CR and sequestration, but we'll be getting that information out here shortly, and as soon as we have a steering committee meeting lined up, we'll let you all know as well, so that the steering committee can decide how best to proceed with the projects that we've got going and the new ones that we got in.
One other thing on the project front for folks, we've been working with the Northeast Climate Science Center as well as the North Central Climate Science Center pretty much 24/7. It seems like the last 6 weeks or so, developing additional climate work as they have wrapped up their RFPs for the next 2 years. Anything you want to say about that, Rick?
Well, and they're doing that synchronously. So the proposals have been out for national solicitation, and we're in the process of helping review the full proposals that both the North Central and the Northeast Climate Science Centers have gotten in. And the deadline for making those cuts, or at least the next round, is in about 2 weeks. Toward the end of April, the Climate Science Centers will be making decisions on those projects.
Say, Mike, I see that you're now on the website. Are you at your computer or are you at Lisa's?
I'm at my computer now.
Now, are you going to run the slides from your computer, or do I turn this over to Lisa?
Turn it over to Lisa.
Okay. Lisa, if you click on the Share My Desktop icon in the center of your computer, you'll have control. Do you see that?
Yes. Can everybody see my desktop now?
I think so. There is about a 4-second delay, I'll tell you, as you advance your slides from when they show up across the net.
Okay. Can everybody see the title slide right now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start. I'm not sure exactly how much information everybody has about our project, so I'm going to go ahead and start with like an introduction of the project and our objectives for this particular project. So the Prairie Pothole region has these interannual wet-dry cycles historically, and so there'd be several years of a dry period followed by several years of a wet period, and these wet-dry cycles are what cause the pulses in productivity that we see in Prairie Pothole wetlands. So you may have a wetland that's full and been full for a while that may not have a lot of, say, invertebrate diversity, and it'll dry out. It'll expose the soils, cause nutrient cycling, and oxidize those sediments. And then when you have a wet period, it fills the wetland back up, and there's a pulse of productivity of invertebrates and vegetation growth. But what we've seen in the Prairie Pothole region, as I'm sure most of you know, is that there's been extensive landscape modification for agricultural purposes, and so there's been a lot of drainage seen on the landscape. A lot of the drainage that we've seen is called consolidation drainage, where they take small temporary and seasonal wetlands in the upper portion of the catchment and drain them into the larger semi-permanent and permanent wetlands in the lower portion of the landscape, usually via ditches. This increases connectivity between those wetlands and affects a lot of things in the system. It can decrease groundwater because that water is no longer sitting in those seasonal and temporary wetlands and allowed to soak into the ground. It's being rushed at a pretty high rate of speed off the landscape and into those semi-permanent and permanent wetlands, which can increase chemicals and allow corridors for invasive species colonization. And the thing that we're looking at is it can also decrease water level fluctuations and cause reductions in the productivity that we see in these wetlands. So I have some pictures here from one of our wetlands. These are some historical aerial photographs, and you can see the way that water used to fluctuate historically. During wet climates, the wetland would fill up, and then during dry climates, the wetland would dry down and expose the shoreline and those sediments in there, and then when it would fill back up again, you would get those pulses in productivity. But during the 70s and 80s, a lot of ditches were added, and so those small temporary and seasonal wetlands were drained into these larger semi-permanent and permanent wetlands. And what you see now are overall larger wetlands. So the wetland here that was historic is what it looks like now currently. So those wetlands are now larger than they used to be. And in addition, we're not seeing those water level fluctuations like we used to. Over here, the wetlands during wet climates and during dry climates and the water levels stay about the same. So overall, we used to have these water level fluctuations. Now the wetlands are fuller than they used to be, and you don't have those water level fluctuations anymore. So we have higher and more stable water levels potentially than we used to. So in addition to that nutrient cycling and increased productivity that we saw with those water fluctuations, the other thing that those fluctuations would do is if the wetlands are sensitive to really minor changes in climate conditions, you may have climate conditions that are different in one part of the prairie pothole region than they are in another, which could provide like a mosaic of different habitat types, which is really important for stopover points for a lot of waterfowl. And if now all those wetlands are higher and more stable than they used to be, then all of them have the same kind of conditions, and there's not as many habitat types available for waterfowl. Also, that shoreline, when it was exposed, would provide foraging habitat and shorebird nesting places during drought years, but high stable water threatens all those benefits for waterbirds. Especially important for piping plover wetlands, the federally threatened, and they nest on that newly exposed shore habitat when the water levels decrease. But if water levels are now high and stable and no longer decrease and expose that shore habitat, it could potentially decrease available habitat for this threatened species. And it's possible that these consolidated wetlands are pretty abundant on the landscape. So what we wanted to do for this project was to see if consolidation drainage is happening on the landscape, how abundant these wetlands are. And so we chose about 140 randomly selected wetlands from across the prairie pothole region in North Dakota. And we had 5 major objectives. I color-coded them here for you so that you can follow along in the presentation the rest of the way. Our first objective was to use high-resolution elevation data to delineate the individual catchments for all of these wetlands so that we could identify the portion of the landscape that directly affects these wetlands. And then we wanted to look at a fine-scale climate index so that we can get an idea of what you would expect the water levels to be during certain climates and to account for the climate differences across the region. We wanted to test and see if there actually was a change in historic and current responses of that water surface area during wet and dry cycles. And then if there is a change from the way that they historically reacted to climate and the way they are currently reacting to climate, our objective 4 was to find out if drainage is what's affecting that change. And lastly, we wanted to look at wetlands that were historically important for piping plovers and to find out if the ones that are no longer being used by piping plovers are being influenced by these water level dynamic changes. So the first thing that we did was gather some high-resolution elevation data. For part of our area, this was LIDAR data. Where LIDAR wasn't available, we purchased radar data at about 5-meter resolution. And we used these digital elevation models to identify the way that water would flow on the landscape, which has allowed us to identify catchments for each of these individual wetlands. And so a catchment, the way we're defining it, may be considered maybe a meta-catchment type in some other people's terminology, because our catchment includes the portion of the landscape that flows into our wetland. But that portion of the landscape may include other smaller wetlands and the catchments for those. So it may be tiny little catchments all converged into one big meta-catchment, but this is the portion of the landscape that would flow into our wetlands, so we could identify the landscape changes in that portion of the landscape and what would directly affect our wetlands. So we collected historical aerial photographs from multiple agencies. We got a bunch from the HAPID office here in North Dakota. We went out to NRCS county offices and we downloaded stuff from USGS Earth Explorer. And we scanned in and georeferenced all the historical aerial photographs that we collected. We collected from 23 different counties, which was over 2,500 historical aerial photos, and scanned and georeferenced all of those. We collected for historic years of 1937 to 1969, expecting that most of the drainage probably happened in the 70s and 80s. And we collected for our sample wetlands and the catchments for our sample wetlands. And then our current years included 2003 to 2010 because those are the years that NAEP photos were available for this area. So from each of those aerial photographs, we digitized the water surface area from the photograph for each available year that we had. Not every historical year was available for every wetland. So for those that were available, we digitized the water surface area, and we used this as a response variable in all of our models. So objective 2 was to develop a fine-scale climate index so that we could account for the variation in climate between photos and between wetlands. So we used PRISM data, which is kind of a high-resolution climate data, and what we used were monthly precipitation values. And we tested a bunch of different models using mixed effects models where our predictor variables were the catchment size and those PRISM monthly precipitation values. And we tested models that looked at precipitation from the previous 12 months or 1 year all the way back to the previous 10 years of precipitation in each wetland. And we accounted for 3 different weights on those previous years and then used AIC to choose the best model. So what we found was the climate index that best explained the water levels in historic photographs was 10 years of monthly precipitation data with a triangular decay on the weight. So the highest weight would be given to the previous 1 year of monthly precipitation, and the lowest weight would be given to the precipitation values from 10 years previous. So our objective 3 was to test for a change in historic and current responses of water surface area. So we wanted to see if water surface area and water level dynamics are responding differently now than they used to be in historic photos. So for that, we did mixed effects models again, accounting for the differences between seasons and wetlands as random effects, and we had predictor variables in there of era, so whether it was historic or current, and then we included that fine-scale climate index from objective 2. We looked at catchment size, and we also accounted for topographic complexity, so those wetlands that may be in steeper topography versus flat topography, and used AIC to choose the best model on those also. And what we found is that the model that best explained this was an era by climate interaction and a catchment size by climate interaction. That model was more than 2.5 times better than the next best model. And what we see from the results of that model were that water levels are clearly higher in current photos than they were in historic photos. And in addition to that, they've decoupled more from climate. So the slope of the red line has gotten flatter, and the confidence intervals are wider, showing that climate is not explaining as much of that variation as it used to be. So the water levels are clearly higher and more stable than they used to be historically. So our objective 4 was to determine if that change in water level dynamics was due to land use or drainage of other wetlands in the catchment. So for that, we used the catchments of all the wetlands, and we digitized the drained wetlands and the remaining wetlands in each of those catchments. For the drained wetlands, we looked at historical photographs and the digital elevation models. And then we also quantified the proportion of row crops in each catchment and the proportion of rows in each catchment. So for example, we have a catchment here where the yellow wetland represents our sample wetlands. These blue wetlands are wetlands that are remaining from the NWI layer. And the red wetlands are those that have been drained. So we identified a drained wetland as a wetland that we could see in NWI or in historical photographs that now has a ditch draining it, and it no longer exists usually in the current photos. So we used mixed effects models again, and our predictor variables this time were the proportion of drained wetlands and remaining wetlands, row crops and roads in each of those catchments. And again, we included the climate index, the size of the catchment, and that topographic complexity into our model and used AIC. And what we found here is that catchment size, of course, was important. Bigger catchments had bigger wetlands. But water levels were also affected by a drained wetland by climate interaction, the remaining wetlands in the proportion, and the row crops in the proportion, and row crop by climate interaction. So what we can see is in the drained, the catchments with high amounts of drainage, that blue line is higher again. So we can see that wetlands in highly drained catchments are bigger than those in catchments with lower amounts of drainage. And again, this line is flatter and the confidence intervals are larger, showing that high drainage catchments have wetlands that have decoupled from climate. So we know that drainage is affecting the water level dynamics, and that highly drained catchments have higher water levels and more stable water levels than those with lower amounts of drainage. In addition, we know that the portion of the catchment that remains as wetland is important in determining the water levels too. So as you increase the amount of remaining wetlands in the landscape, you increase the amount of water storage capacity in the catchment, and thus you decrease the water level of the consolidated wetlands. We had some interesting results when we looked at the proportion of row crops in the catchment. And when we have high amounts of precipitation, you can see that the proportion of the catchment that remains as row crops is slightly higher. And this is because row crops have high runoff on them. So as water falls into the catchment, the water runs off of the row crop and fills up that wetland in the lower portion of the catchment. That effect is reversed when you have medium and low amounts of precipitation. It's because we think it's because the crops are using up that precipitation to meet growth requirements before it's allowed to run off into the wetland. And in addition to that, the row crops are capable of pulling water out of the wetland and into the upland to meet their growth requirements. The last objective we wanted to look at was the piping plover habitat, and we wanted to evaluate if the use of piping plovers currently in historically important wetlands was influenced by these changes in water level dynamics. So we collected piping plover census data that was available, and that was censuses from 1979 through 2011, and we selected 32 wetlands, all of which used to have piping plovers on them in censuses, and about half of them still have piping plovers on them during recent censuses, but the other half of them are no longer used by piping plovers or have very little use by piping plovers. So we again digitized the water levels for all the years that we did for the other objectives, but in addition we added 2001 and 2011 from imagery that we had available because these were good census years. They were international piping plover census years, so we wanted to include water levels from those years also. And we calculated the percent full of the wetland. So we used the fullest year as the full point of each wetland, and then calculated for all the other years the percent full of that wetland. And we used that as a predictor variable in a regression, and our response variable for that was the plover abundance from those censuses. And what we found was that as the wetland becomes more full, piping plovers are virtually absent. So when you have a really full wetland, so the wettest years, there's virtually no piping plovers found on the wetland. And what we know is that currently they're more full than they used to be. And we knew that for all the other sample wetlands. This holds true when we look at piping plover wetlands. We can see that in current years, they're nearly full a lot of the time, but in historic years, you would have wetlands that would dry down and fill back up, and overall, they're not as full as they used to be. So we know that wetlands are fuller than they were historically, and that the water levels are more stable. We know that this is due to consolidation drainage on the landscape, And our piping plover analysis tells us that fuller wetlands have virtually no plovers on them, and water levels aren't decreasing even in dry climates. So we have less plover habitat available in current years than we used to historically. And because of our other objectives, we can relate this back to drainage on the landscape. So overall, our results, we developed a method for generating wetland catchments, which I think is applicable outside of this study and can be used in a lot of other wetland studies that want to look at the catchments and the modifications that have been done to the landscape that directly affect a wetland. We figured out that the water level for these semi-permanent and permanent wetlands in this region are actually influenced by the past 10 years of precipitation, and that likely includes an entire wet-dry cycle. We know that water level dynamics are different than they were historically, and that consolidation drainage are affecting those water level dynamics. And that as those water level dynamics are decreasing, it's affecting piping plover abundance on the wetlands. So I think that this study gives us a better understanding of the extent of consolidation drainage across the Prairie Pothole region and helps inform managers about making decisions about the regulation of consolidation drainage. It also allows us to focus restoration efforts, and instead of just focusing restoration efforts on a particular wetland, we need to look at catchment level restoration and restoring seasonal and temporary wetlands within a catchment to restore the water level dynamics to the consolidated wetlands. And this models will also help us predict the outcomes of wetland restoration on water level dynamics. In addition, if we know that there are biological implications to these more stable wetlands, and we see lower productivity of invertebrates, which decreases food for migratory waterbirds in the region. It decreases the habitat available for foraging for waterfowl and nesting for shorebirds like piping plovers, and it can also increase invasive species in the wetlands and the landscape. So there's acknowledgement for that, and if anybody has any questions, I'll take questions now.
Thanks, Lisa. That was a terrific overview of the work. We'll open it up for questions for Lisa or Mike. This is your chance to stump Mike, even though he said nothing.
Hi there. This is Mike Larson in Minnesota.
Hi,
Yes.
I had a question about your selecting of the sample for the piping plover analysis and how you selected those 32 wetlands. I guess I'm curious whether that 16 and 16 half and half split is an artifact of how you selected them, or if that's representative of about half the wetlands that used to have plover habitat currently do.
So we looked at the census data that was available, which was limited in some areas. And the thing about some of the census information is that some years were blank or may have had zeros, and we were unsure in some wetlands whether that meant they weren't censused or whether they were censused and no plovers were found. So we limited our sample down to those that we knew we had fairly good census data for, and that they had been censused for multiple years. Some of them had maybe only been done 1 or 2. And then from those, we tried to sub-select some that were regularly still used and some that weren't. And it ended up being about half. There's a couple in there that more than likely fall into that no longer used, but in some current years when it was really, really dry, would still be used here and there, which is why we used plover abundance as the response variable in the models, so that we weren't doing any kind of, maybe they were used, maybe they weren't kind of thing. But we wanted to make sure that we got a sample of some that were still used and some that weren't, so we could see the difference between those.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, this is Rick Nelson. I have a couple of questions for you and Mike. The first one would be, how would you see tying your work into climate projections? And what kind of thing might we look at in terms of the potential projections that show it's going to get wetter up in this part of the world, perhaps?
That's question number one. And question number two is, how do you guys see this tying in with some of the work that Ray and Robert are doing on pattern tile drainage? And we're kind of under the double whammy for wetlands with climate change and increased tile drainage and consolidation.
I can tackle at least the first question, and I think that it could pretty easily, because of the climate model that we developed, be incorporated with climate projections, depending on how good the climate projection models are. Obviously, we incorporated precipitation into our model, so adding precipitation values or getting new precipitation values would be pretty easy to incorporate into the model. I think that other things, you know what I mean, like temperature changes would also have to be included in that. So I think it depends on how good of a projection we can get for the climate projection models, but incorporating them into our model would simply only be a matter of changing that climate index. And I think that could be incorporated pretty easily. And Mike, do you want to tackle how this can be affected with Ray's stuff?
Sure. And maybe I'll add something to the climate side of things too. One of the challenges I think with incorporating the climate scenarios into how it's going to affect the Prairie potholes is that the climate scenarios are really pretty poor at modeling the dynamics of the system, and I think what really affects the Prairie potholes are indeed these hydrologic, the seasonal these interannual dynamics of the system. It's really what drives a lot of the productivity in the ecosystem. And to yet we don't really have climate projection models that can account for those. And I don't know whether or not those are really on the horizon yet. But that aside, though, some of the findings of this study could be helpful in that, at least looking at potentially looking at the time horizon in which things like precipitation events would be influencing water level dynamics in wetlands. And with the tile thing, we pretty much looked at, we considered any type of drainage. Mind you, there's probably very little tile drainage in the areas that we were looking at. But if we saw evidence that a wetland was drained, then we pretty much considered it drained, whether it was ditched or tiled. So I think you would see these same kind of patterns in wetlands that are receiving pattern tile drainage as well. So I would think that the tile drainage study could probably incorporate some of these results to help better understand how the output of those tile systems is influencing those systems.
So, Mike, this is Mike Olson. What's your schedule for publication of this?
We're looking at trying to get. We've probably got. Lisa, how many papers are we thinking here? It's like 4 or so.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, I think 4.
Basically, follow the more or less follow the objectives. And I think we're probably going to get those things in the pipeline or submitted in this fiscal year. So they should be. I'm not too sure exactly when they come out. That's a lot harder to tell. We can kind of control when we submit them, but how long the process takes is a little harder to know.
Anybody else have some questions for Mike and Lisa?
Mike?
Yep.
Yeah, Paul Wapisto. Very good presentation. A couple of questions from it that may or may not be easy for you guys to answer. Early on, Lisa, you were talking about the infiltration rate from the seasonal and temporary wetlands into groundwater. Do you have, either of you have any information on the rate of that infiltration? Or would that vary with soil types and that type of thing?
No, we don't have any data on that at all, but I do believe it does vary quite a bit with soil types. Like I would expect it to, that I would expect that areas in like outwash would that movement of water through the soils would be a lot quicker, but we don't have that kind of data. Some of the some of Chip Eulis's group here has been looking into groundwater movements a lot more. I don't have a real good handle on what their time frame is for getting more information out on that issue. We've kind of toyed with the idea of maybe trying to make some to try to learn a little bit about that from the data set that we have by looking at maybe if we can look at including soil information into that climate index and how it predicts how these larger wetlands fluctuate. And we may still yet do that, but I'm not. That'd be a really coarse way to look at that question.
There are also, we use, hydrological modeling to model the surface water flow to develop the catchments, and they do have models out there that use groundwater, or that incorporate groundwater too. I don't know how good they are, or what kind of information is required to put into them, and how well they do at describing the flow of groundwater. So it's something that I came across, but we haven't incorporated into our stuff.
Second one might be equally as challenging to try to answer, but you mentioned that with the higher or stable levels on the semi or permanent wetlands, that there has been a loss in habitat acres, or loss of habitat, I should say, for the piping plover. Any estimates on how much habitat has been lost due to this?
No, we have not gone to that level to try to estimate that. But for a different project, actually, I'm actually working on remotely sensing piping plover habitat on the known alkali lakes that are important for piping plovers. The trick was trying to understand the importance of this particular factor on piping plovers is that our data on plovers dating or going back to kind of prior to all these changes is really poor. There is sporadic reports of piping plovers being kind of or breeding throughout the Prairie pothole region, but now we really only see them much more restricted to the Coteau. So it's difficult to say whether or not that what extent they really use the rest of the Prairie pothole region. We know that from some reports that they did. So getting a handle on actually quantifying the loss of habitat could be really difficult because we'd have to try to figure out which wetlands plovers would use when they grew down, and that would be pretty tricky because there's just not much data out there. But as another one of the things that we're looking at for this other study on plovers and alkali wetlands is to try to figure out what landscape features are that plovers might be selecting when they're picking the types of wetlands that they're going to use, and that might be useful at sort of getting to an estimate of those numbers. But without data from the the 50s, 60s era, it's going to be a bit of a guess on whether or not they were really used all that much.
Thank you.
Lisa, it's Rick again. I have another question. One of your bullets said something about, I'm paraphrasing now, that the information will be useful to help inform managers regarding consolidation regulations. I'm going to ask you to give me your elevator speech on how this information is going to be useful in that regard. Since LCCs are very focused on management relevance, this certainly seems to be a key point.
I think that they could be helpful. I think that if we recognize that draining a seasonal and or temporary wetland is not just affecting that wetland, but could also be affecting other wetlands within the catchment and affecting the dynamics of the seasonal and temporary wetlands, it'll help us and recognizing in restoration and in regulation to control drainage of those seasonal and temporary wetlands. So if we look at from a restoration perspective that we would have to restore the entire catchment or at least several wetlands in the catchment and look at it from that level, then we could also look at conservation from that level too. And that if we are conserving at a catchment level for these seasonal or for the semi-permanent and permanent wetlands, that would include those seasonal and temporary wetlands. So it's not just a loss of, say, the habitat of that particular small wetland, which tend to get drained pretty easily, especially for agricultural purposes, but that drainage would affect other wetlands in the catchment. I think recognizing that would help us in the regulation of maintaining the water level dynamic.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Lisa or Mike? All right. Well, Lisa, and especially thank you so much for an excellent presentation, and for the folks on the phone, thanks for joining us today. We'll look forward to the fact sheets that come out related to these 5 objectives, as well as the eventual publications. As we mentioned earlier, this will be available for those who may want to listen to it after the fact or share it with somebody who would find this information useful. Ashley, about 2 days until that gets posted?
Yep, it should be up and live tomorrow.
Okay, terrific. And thank you again, Ashley, for the great work on the annual report, and for folks who are working with the LCC on those projects for that annual report here. Be posted momentarily. If not, you'll see a link to receive an electronic copy of that. With that, we'll reconvene again on our monthly tech team calls on May 1st, which will be the first Wednesday in May. So with that, thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you.